Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the New Books in Buddhist Studies podcast, a podcast channel on the New Books Network. I'm Tori Montrose, the host of the channel. Today, we'll be talking to Chenzing Han about her new book, Be the Refuge, Raising the Voices of Asian American Buddhists. Chenzing, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tori. It's great to be here.
I wonder if you could begin by telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what brought you to Buddhism and Buddhist studies.
Absolutely. So I was not raised Buddhist. I'm Chinese American, came to this country when I was about 4 years old, and my parents are non-religious, as is pretty common, I think, for people of their generation from China. And I really began to really delve into a personal interest in Buddhism in college, maybe around my junior year. In fact, I studied in South Africa, which I mention a little bit briefly in this book, Be the Refuge. And some of the first Buddhist communities I actually visited in person were in and near Cape Town. But I came to the academic study of Buddhism fairly late in my undergraduate career. In fact, at my final quarter at Stanford, Ben Brosey, who is now at University of Michigan, he was teaching a class on Buddhism and death. And so that was really the first course I took in religious studies, and I was quite intrigued to learn more. And then through a sort of circuitous set of circumstances, I ended up at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, which is, of course, where actually you and I first met. So my bachelor's degree was very interdisciplinary. It was in science, technology, and society with a minor in cultural and social anthropology. My BA thesis had nothing to do with religion. It was about mobile phones in South Africa, but it was an interview-based project. And so I think that actually transferred over well for this particular project. So I ended up in a master's program at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, actually the equivalent of a Master's of Divinity. So I earned a degree in Buddhist studies, but also a certificate in Buddhist chaplaincy. And after I graduated, I did a year-long residency in hospital chaplaincy. And it was really after that time that I was still sitting on all this material from this master's thesis, all these interviews, and I really felt urgently that this needed to become a book. I felt urgently, but it still took many years for that book to come to fruition. So I think between my first interview and the time that this book was actually published earlier this year was maybe about a 7-year span.
Mm-hmm. Great. I actually wanted to ask you a question about your experience in South Africa. I also studied abroad in South Africa as an
Oh, wow.
undergraduate, doing something completely different to what I do now.
Amazing.
But I was wondering I found that time to be, a time where, being so far from home and in such a unique and distinctive culture like South Africa, I found it a very great place to experiment and try on new things and, new identities and things like that. So I'm wondering if there was something about that experience. You mentioned, that was some of your first encounters with Buddhist communities was in South Africa, and that's, pretty unique for a lot of folks to have their first experience with Buddhism be in South Africa, maybe unexpected. So I'm wondering if you could say if there's anything about that experience that maybe nudged you to visit communities there.
Yeah, I went to South Africa thinking I would end up thinking a lot about race. And actually, what came up more were issues of gender, but
Mm,
also this sort of personal exploration of religion. And I think being just quite struck by Buddhism's reach and scope. So I'd taken a gap year before college and
mm,
spent some time in Asia. So I was able to kind of experience Buddhist communities in Thailand and Nepal and Tibet, just kind of briefly, more as a tourist. But then to see that also expressed in South Africa, kind of unexpectedly, I remember running into Tzu Chi there and thinking like, oh my
mm,
goodness, there are Taiwanese Buddhists here. And
mm,
the scope is quite broad. And then I think certain dynamics that in retrospect, I could see happen here in the US too, predominantly white convert groups and just sort of like, I think what really struck me was, thinking about what does it mean to think about being somewhat of a minority religion, right, within the broader scope. And then for my interviews, actually, they weren't about religion, but most of the people I spoke to were Christian. And I was actually very compelled by their kind of the ways that they wove together faith and social justice. And so, I knew my own affinities leaned toward Buddhism, but it also made me wonder about how Buddhism and social justice and this kind of more service-oriented or spiritual care work could all weave together. So I'd say it planted a lot of really powerful seeds that would blossom later, and it was striking to have this big stack of books with me that on Buddhism, just like a very wide range of books, but then to, try to like experience that in a pretty unexpected setting. And I'd say maybe I guess in Be the Refuge, there's little bits and pieces. I think something that's striking about the book is that I actually wrote it primarily while living in Cambodia and Thailand. So I'm really writing a book about Asian Americans based in the US, but doing it from a distance. And I found that for me personally, I actually kind of needed that distance. Like you said, the kind of like strangeness of being displaced in a different setting, and that I think it helped me sort of question my assumptions. And frankly, it was also just to shift my experience of what it meant to be an Asian person, to be an Asian appearing person, to be an Asian person in South Africa is a very different experience than to, be that here in the States, or to be that in Cambodia or Thailand for that matter.
Sure. Yeah. Wow. That's really illuminating. Yeah. That's really interesting. Well, if you could take us through a little bit more about, the inspiration to do the book. Certainly the master's thesis you've already mentioned is sort of sprung out as a result of your master's thesis. But if you could talk more about that process of developing the book, and you also mentioned in the book itself the kind of multiple lives that the book has had and iterations. If you could speak about kind of that whole process.
Sure. Yeah. So I remember casting about for a master's thesis topic, and I'm very good at missing the obvious, but the more I started to think about Buddhism in America, and particularly reading sociologists of religion like Wendy Katz, Sharon Tse, Carolyn Chen, Jiaming Bao, their work, which is so invaluable and tends to be cited at particular temples and focused on, a particular ethnic group, whether it's Thai or Sri Lankan Buddhists, Taiwanese Buddhists, etc. And I should mention Paul Numerich's work as well. And so what really struck me is often there'd be a line or two or a paragraph or so just about how hard it was to find young people in these spaces. And it just got me more curious to think about, well, young adult Buddhists must be out there, and particularly young adult Asian American Buddhists. And I think, so that was one strand. Another strand was just reading more of the popular literature and thinking, Buddhists are definitely a minority in America, maybe only about 1% according to the Pew Forum's 2012 statistics. But of those, 2/3 are of Asian heritage. So again, I felt like there was this kind of disjuncture between the fact that the majority of American Buddhists are of Asian heritage, but then what's visible in especially the popular media. And then within academic writing, kind of this ongoing debate, I guess we could say, about two Buddhisms. So that was certainly one of the strands as well, this idea that there's a kind of binary between white convert Buddhists on the one hand and Asian immigrant Buddhists on the other hand. And so on a very personal level, I just couldn't ever quite figure out where I fit in there as an Asian American convert Buddhist. And so I had just had all these questions around that I wanted to explore. And then, I'd be remiss not to talk about also Aaron Lee, who was the author of the blog Angry Asian Buddhist, which he started all the way back in 2009. And so he was writing about these issues of race and representation with a focus on Asian Americans. And all of this sort of came together. And it was really Aaron, I remember in a blog post of his saying, you need to go, just wanting to go out there, gather these stories, hear these voices. And so I thought, okay, I'll just maybe interview a few people. I'll focus on young adults so that I can do these interviews in English. And I was really interested in looking at a broad range of ethnicities. So Asian Americans are spoken of, often lumped together, but of course we represent such a wide range of ethnicities. And so the only way I could think to kind of gather people from multiple backgrounds under this umbrella of Asian American was to I had to limit my scope somehow. So to focus it on young adults and explain to people that, these interviews will be in English. So there's more I could say, I guess. I didn't think that a lot of people would be interested. So I actually kept this kept the scope, kept the parameters, I should say, of my categories pretty loose. I said young adult, over 18, 20s or 30s is fine. A couple of young at heart 40-year-olds kind of snuck in. um, Often I think in our Buddhist spaces, this happens, like the group sort of like the cohort moves and gets older, but the group doesn't really, it's like the young adults became 30 and 40 and they're still calling themselves the young adult groups. So I wanted to be kind of, what's the word? Maybe like just attentive to the fact that sometimes in Buddhist spaces, young, actually means kind of older. And then for Asian American as well, I wanted people who were of full or partial Asian heritage, and I wasn't very strict about what that meant. I didn't say you have to be a citizen of the U.S. So again, keeping those parameters kind of loose. And then also Buddhists, I didn't need people to be card-carrying Buddhists or even out publicly as Buddhists, just people with an affinity for Buddhism. And in retrospect, I'm glad I kept things like this because part of the project was wanting also just to interrogate these categories. I mean, even this term Asian American Buddhist, so many people said, I've never thought about that as a term. Like I've thought of Asian American Christian, for example, but I've just never thought about Asian American Buddhist, this particular intersection of my own race and my own religion. And so it was really fascinating to talk with people. And I was very greedy, so my interview protocol was really long. People were very patient with me, and these interviews were, 1.5 to 5.5 hours long. So people had a lot to say, and I think just based on the sheer length of the interviews, I realized, I felt like we just touched a nerve together, and there was a lot more to explore together.
Yes. I want to circle back to Erin's role in the book in a little bit, but I also was wondering if you could say, you drop in a brief mention in the book to the advice that the novelist Ruth Ozeki gives you about this project, and I wonder if you could share that. It was such a great story.
Sure. Yeah. Ruth Ozeki, who just came out with a book called her latest novel, The Book of Form and Emptiness, which I'm very excited to read. So back in 2014, when she was promoting A Tale for the Time Being, she gave a talk and was very kind afterwards. When I kind of went up to her and said, like, I have this thesis and I'm trying to turn it into a book. I don't know if you have advice. And so she very generously spoke to me on the phone later. And a piece of advice that just really stuck with me was she really urged me to make the book an account of my curiosity and to write myself into the book. So it took me several years to really fully incorporate that advice. So you talked about earlier the multiple lives of this book. And I had this first version of a book, here was out of a master's thesis. I was living in Cambodia. I wasn't even connected to an academic institution. So this was all kind of new to me, new territory. And I managed to write a 90,000 word, academic book with lots and lots of footnotes. And I would sometimes bury stories about myself in these footnotes, but I felt not quite brave enough to come out of those footnotes into the main text. And sort of very fortunately, this manuscript went through peer review. I had some helpful feedback from anonymous reviewers, and it was ultimately rejected, which at the time felt like such a blow. But it actually, what it did was open up a completely new opportunity to basically throw out the entire draft and rewrite it from scratch. And the way I thought about it then was, how do I write this book in a way that speaks to Aaron and his friends, that speaks to young adult Asian American Buddhists? And as I started doing that, I realized I would have to do exactly what Ruth Ozeki advised, which was really to make it a story of my journey, which, is kind of a narrative thread throughout the whole book and is the very truthful origins of the book, and that I would have to share more of my own story. And it was a bit of a dancing act to try to, weave that in while also making room for the voices of 89 other interviewees.
Sure. Yeah, I think you do that masterfully. It's quite a feat to both include your story and interweave it with all of these other voices. I wonder if you could say more about the challenges of this kind of, I don't know if you would consider it an autoethnography or not, but this sort of method, as you mentioned, of kind of including yourself and having an honest account of the process within the book itself. I wonder if you could speak to that experience and some of the challenges, in addition to what we just talked about, which is, that it's hard to fit it all in.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I remember, when I did 26 in-person interviews, which is such a rich source of material. I transcribed those myself and spent a lot of time with those. And then in addition, I had these 63 email interviews. And fortunately for email interviews, because there is some limitation in terms of not being able to meet, synchronously and face to face, I was able to follow up with maybe half of those people and continue to exchange emails. I've since met many of those people in person, but would trying to take this kind of bottom up approach and just spending a lot of time with these voices. And I think maybe one of the hardest parts at first was just this temptation to like obscure myself and erase myself and just deliver these voices. But I realized it was very hard to kind of weave them together. It's almost like there wasn't really a frame for weaving them together. And I realized like, well, I was present at all of these interviews, and I've always really appreciated when anthropologists and sociologists are more self-reflexive in their work, so we can really understand where they're coming from and how that invariably their own positionality will shape kind of the end product. And so I think it was really just this iterative process. And something that really helped me actually was doing this year-long chaplaincy residency. So this is called CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. And it's a very, supervised kind of learning in providing spiritual care, doing ministry. So I was doing this in a hospital setting, and there's this kind of action reflection model, and it's kind of very iterative. So you are on the units, but then there's a lot of self-reflection of how were we personally impacted. And I think doing that kind of writing and then giving myself permission to start integrating this kind of more chaplaincy oriented writing. And frankly, I actually really dislike that we make these kinds of distinctions, right, between intellectual and spiritual. And in a way, the Institute of Buddhist Studies was just such a perfect home for this book, as a place that feels to me both like an intellectual and spiritual home, as a place that really encourages the integration of these different facets. And so, as with many things, I think it ended up being, having to sort of cut from the material of the 89 other interviewees, or consolidate, or pick the best quotes, or, I have this like big document of parts I've discarded, so then I can feel like it's being composted or will be regrown into a future project, so I don't feel like it's completely being thrown out. And then for myself, I think the hard part was actually then having to generate more. So the issue was not so much like cutting those stories, but trying to decide what stories of my own do I want to lift up and that are important for helping guide the reader through what can be, I think, a somewhat perplexing sort of symphony, maybe at times cacophony of voices, because there are so many voices. And at some point, I think I decided, rather than just focusing on a few people, to really try to weave in as many as possible, in part because I think that category of Asian American Buddhist is like this. It's kind of unwieldy, and it's kind of slippery, and sometimes it feels fragmented. It's certainly not monolithic. And I wanted sort of the experience of reading the book itself to kind of reflect the category itself that I was exploring and interrogating.
Yes, absolutely. I wonder, along those lines, if you could talk a bit about the organization. You have these 4 parts. Part 1 is Trailblazers, Part 2, Bridge Builders, Part 3, Interrogators, Part 4, Refuge Makers. But in fact, we see a lot of recurring characters kind of moving between these different parts. And within each of these parts, you have these one-word chapters that kind of create a feeling or a frame of mind going into that chapter. I wonder if you could say a little bit about how that developed and maybe talk us through briefly each of the 4 parts.
Sure. Yeah. So I really have to thank Noelle, one of my interviewees, Noelle Alumit, for this idea. These parts are really based on a kind of generational model. So I'll just actually read briefly from the book because I think this is helpful.
Sure.
From page 134. So Noelle was proposing this alternative for talking about quote unquote convert Buddhists. And he said, I might suggest generational categories. Many Asian people might say, I'm first generation American or I'm third generation American. I think we can use this for Buddhism. By indicating a generation, one can still value one's Buddhism, just like a first-gen American is as much an American as a fifth-gen American. But it also gives insight into where a person falls in the induction of Buddhism in one's life and background. And Noah himself was born in the Philippines and raised Catholic in Los Angeles. So this really struck me because I was so used to thinking about generations, like what generation are you? Okay, I mostly interviewed millennials, right? For example, maybe a few baby boomers. Those voices are woven in. I'd love to see a book on Gen Z Buddhists. So there's that kind of way of talking about generations. And among Asian Americans, it's common to be asked, are you first generation, second generation, third generation, etc. Those categories, of course, get very complicated when your parents are from different generations and so forth. But Noah really introduced me to this notion of like, oh, what generation American Buddhist are you? So then I started thinking, well, several of my interviewees were Jodo Shin Buddhists who are really multi-gen American Buddhists. Their families have been Buddhists in America for multiple generations. And that became part one of the book, which I call Trailblazers. And then there's a pretty big group of people whose parents were Buddhists and had raised them Buddhist in this country. So I called them second gen Buddhists. And that became part two. This kind of bridge builders is what I called them. And then based on Noel's model, and part of the reason was a lot of the Asian Americans I spoke to had a little bit like uneasiness about identifying as convert. Partly they felt that word was very Christian. Partly they felt that convert Buddhism just had this connotation of being white Buddhist, and they wanted to somehow be able to claim some of the importance of their cultural heritage in this process of, converting, or maybe that you would use another term to describe it, to Buddhism. And so I called these quote unquote first gen Buddhists. So there would be people like myself who are really the first generation in this country to be Buddhist in America. And then finally, this fourth section, as you rightly point out, these are not actually exactly hard and fast categories. What it did help me do was just divide up some of the interviewees so that I could more emphasize certain voices in certain parts. But the fourth part, Refuge Makers, was really a tribute to Aaron, who I think wanted to weave together these different voices, think about issues of justice, think about issues of representation and race. And so this fourth part was really a lot of fun to kind of weave together all these voices from the previous three parts. And I would say that that's really when the moment when that came together was when the book started finally taking a form. And within these 4 parts, there's actually 3 chapters, as you note, that each of them has a one-word title, whether it's affinity or anger, or the last one, solidarity, for example. And within each of the 4 parts, there's just 3 chapters each, so 12 chapters total. And those 3 chapters are also meant to sort of arc. So in a way, the first chapter tends to focus on more of the challenges of the group. And then the second chapter tends to focus on, us kind of grappling with and working through. And then the third chapter within each part, I won't say it's fully resolved, but I would say there's a greater sense of resolution, or trying to lift up more the sources of, the ways that Buddhism is a source of strength for different young adult Asian American Buddhists versus, having it be sometimes a source of shame, or just something that people don't want to talk about because they're tired of the kind of stereotypes that they're confronted with. And Aaron wrote so beautifully about these stereotypes, humorously too, I should add, stereotypes of the Oriental monk, which Janie Wimmer, also her book Virtual Orientalism, I think does a brilliant job of sort of analyzing that trope for us in popular culture. But, this Oriental monk stereotype, or superstitious immigrant stereotypes, or Aaron talking about very provocatively this notion of a banana Buddhist, that, you're basically just yellow on the outside, white on the inside. Essentially, you're like a white convert Buddhist who happens to be Asian. And so the names for these different parts, trailblazers, etc., is kind of, for me, it was me imagining like, well, rather than these tropes of Oriental monks, superstitious immigrant, banana Buddhists, what do I see when I listen to these people? And so the 4 parts come out of the kinds of, I think, frankly, the power that I see in Buddhist Asian America.
The world is racing to get back to normal and start meeting up in person again. But after the year we've all had, getting back to feeling normal takes time. If you're feeling overwhelmed by it all, you're not alone. Something like 50% of Americans struggle with their mental health. We all need help sometimes. I know I do. So what should you do? Well, you should ask for help. Talkspace makes it easy to get that help. Talkspace matches you with a licensed therapist and makes it easy to schedule live video sessions, all from the comfort of your device. You can start messaging your therapist the same day you sign up, and you work with your therapist on your own schedule without having to wait weeks for appointments. Whether you're a parent, a student, a millennial, or just someone having a hard day, Talkspace can help you feel better. Talkspace offers individual and couples therapy in addition to medication prescription services. Whether you're experiencing depression, anxiety, or other problems, Talkspace is the #1 online therapy platform to help you sort through any issue. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com and get $100 off your first month with the promo code NBN. That's $100 off when you use the code NBN at Talkspace.com.
Thank you. That's really clarifying to hear you talk through some of those things, because having read the book, as you have described, it's such a tapestry, but kind of hearing some of your thoughts behind organizing it adds additional layers. It makes me want to go back and revisit, especially when using this in the classroom, which we can talk about a little bit later. We've mentioned Erin a little bit already. I thought I would ask you to just sort of provide a little bit of background of about your relationship with Aaron Lee and his, the way he figures into this book. Certainly, you can't get through the first page really without his presence, and it's woven beautifully throughout and very movingly at the end with his passing away. But I wonder if you could just say more about his life and influence and your relationship and how that figures into the book.
Right. So, I first knew Aaron just as the Angry Asian Buddhist, and he was blogging anonymously there. And I realized, he's been blogging for a while, even earlier than that, on a group blog called Dharma Folk. And once I started this project at the Institute of Buddhist Studies, my advisor was Scott Mitchell. And fortunately, Scott was very active on the Buddhist blogosphere at the time. And so was the person I would later learn is Aaron. So Scott put me in touch with Aaron. I was very nervous because I thought this person's going to be angry or rude or something. And of course, he ends up being the most friendly, most generous person. He was living in LA at the time. And so we kind of immediately struck up a friendship. He was incredibly helpful for the project itself, just letting people know that I was doing these interviews. And, I think that there was sort of this I guess there was the blogger persona of Aaron, but then there was just Aaron Lee as a person who was half Jewish, half Toisanese, had a very sort of complex and interesting and rich relationship to both Buddhism and his Asian heritage. And we used to joke that Aaron knows all Buddhists. It just seemed like he would just know so many people. And, to this day, I recently was just down in LA a couple of weeks ago and was meeting up with mutual friends of Aaron, people he'd introduced us to. So in many ways, this book is a tribute to Aaron. And the second rewrite was very much after Aaron's, really untimely death from cancer at the age of 34. That's when I threw out the academic draft because it made no sense anymore. It's sort of like his really unexpected death and wanting to continue his vision of what was possible for Buddhist Asian America became the impetus for this book. So there's much more I could say, but I'd say in many ways, Alexander Chi encourages us to write for our dead. And I think in reading that advice and also thinking about Ruth's advice, in many ways, this has become more clear in this past 9 months or so since the book has released. But it's a book that's about spiritual friendship that was formed through spiritual friendship, formed through lots of emails and late night texts and, a few in-person visits. I always forget that I never got to visit Aaron as many times in person as would have been ideal. And it's been very moving to be able to, stay in touch with his parents and his family and just continue to continue the amazing work in community with others, the amazing work that Aaron did.
Yeah, it's really great to see, the ways in which, you can see very clearly within the book the way, he inspired the process. But even since the book has been out now for some months, you can see, as you had mentioned, that you hadn't necessarily expected it to touch a nerve for so many folks. And you can see this kind of ripple effect of the work that you did and the inspiration he provided. And I can only imagine that he would be very happy to see the success of the book so far and the work that you and others have been doing on the organizing side. And so yeah, it's a beautiful tribute. I wondered if you could, getting into some of the recurring themes in the book. One of the things that I found that really struck me the most was about this kind of challenge of labels around identity. Especially I found as you mentioned, when you're talking about part 2 with bridge builders, these not quite converts, but these perhaps second generation or first generation, depending on how you're looking at it, Buddhists, and the difficulty that these folks had with this label of Buddhist. I think you mentioned a couple of times in the book too that the Pew Forum, the survey data about Buddhists, and how some of your interviewees said, well, I don't know if I would have responded definitively as Buddhist for Pew Forum, but here I am talking to you, and I'm a Buddhist identifying, on the, in our interview. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that difficulty around identification and the challenges it posed for your interviewees and for you as a researcher in terms of outreach and writing about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are many parts to that question, so I'm trying to think where to begin. I mean, certainly for reaching out, I think it really helped that, I myself identified as Buddhist and Asian American. I remember in one interview, someone just saying like, "Are you Christian?" And I said, "Oh, no, actually, I didn't necessarily lead with my own identity, but I was very open about it." And so I could just see them visibly relax. And I think in that moment, I don't know, it just made me think about, all of the kind of obstacles, what it means to be a racial and religious minority. And that looks like, discrimination or bullying, or the kind of, just on a psychological level, what it feels like to not belong and to be told you don't belong, to be harassed for wearing a Buddha pendant and so forth. And I think I found it really powerful to talk to people who'd been raised by immigrant parents, but often there were gaps in terms of language, in terms of even just trying to understand, what is this practice? What does this chant mean? What is this ritual? Sometimes feeling like, oh, I'm not a good enough Buddhist compared to my parents or grandparents. But also, so there's this kind of like vertical dimension with, within one's own family or within one's own community and ethnic community, but then also this horizontal dimension of looking around and noticing, well, all the spokespeople for Buddhism appear to be white men or white scholars or white converts, and this kind of feeling like, does my own Buddhism matter? And even, in schools, people's own forms of Buddhism not really ever being represented, I think. So I think that just proceeding carefully in terms of interviews, and I'm just I don't know, I remain sort of awed and humbled by people's willingness to talk with me and their openness. And I think I'm very grateful for the chaplaincy training, because I think a lot of that informed the types of just listening and invitation. And, not every interview went well. And that in and of itself was also informative, that there were times when people didn't want to share more or kind of really like shut down. And those were also moments of learning for me. And I guess I would say that, sociologists' notion of sort of kind of having an ascribed identity versus an achieved identity for these second generation bridge builder Buddhists in particular, it was very inspiring to hear them talk about their spiritual journeys and the kind of ways in which they'd inherited a certain form of Buddhism. And then often, especially in college, the first time really being away from their families, away from their temples, and starting to make sense of their own Buddhism within this broader form of American Buddhism and also global Buddhism. And, I trace Eric's story, which I found to be so moving, the kind of ongoing process of trying to understand his parents and finding eventually a place of, it's always an ongoing process, so it's not an end point, but a stopping point that felt more inclusive and understanding of his parents' Buddhism, not needing to denigrate that, but also an ability to try to understand for himself, what does it mean for me, as someone who grew up speaking English and who's most comfortable in that language and understands Buddhism in a very different context? How do I kind of, there's a chapter called Reclamation, so kind of like reclaim Buddhism for myself.
Right. Yeah, I found it really fascinating. There's some interesting parallels, in my own experience, being really interested in Buddhism and after college moving to Japan. And I wanted to talk to everybody I met in Japan about their religious beliefs.
Right.
And it was very awkward for many people, the directness of my questions, the naivety of asking, are you Buddhist? And can you talk to me about, and the identity, the kind of resistance about identifying with those kind of direct labels of saying, well, I mean, my family is Buddhist, and we go to temples, for various holidays, and of course, many of them would have butsudan altars in their homes, but to kind of identify their, with their hold that individual identity as a Buddhist was a little more complicated, and people were more reticent
Mhm.
to answer in that way. And so I saw some interesting kind of parallels that, oftentimes in the Japanese setting, it can be kind of mixed in with, relationship to the idea of kind of Christian religiosity and
Mm.
identifying on a personal kind of individual level, with kind of ascribing to a single faith,
Mhm, mhm.
but on the ground. And similarly, like with the Pew Forum, but in Japan, there's plenty of surveys that say, that a lot of people in Japan don't identify with um, any religious identity. And then, the temples are still quite popular in major holidays and
Mm,
years and
mhm,
whatnot. And again, these butsudan home altars. So
mhm,
this kind of grappling with different ideas about what it means to be a Buddhist. Like, what is a
mhm.
Buddhist? I think your book really addresses that in so many ways,
Mm.
and really leaves the question open, rather than tries to close it and resolve it for us. It leaves it
Right,
open, which is,
right.
much more fruitful, I think, from a scholarly perspective, but hopefully also welcome from a more general perspective, just on a societal level,
Mm,
to sort of open that up. So I
mm,
really appreciated that discussion, especially. Let's see. So I'm wondering if also, you could say a little bit about um, the in the let's see, in the fourth part in Refuge Makers, you talk a
mm,
bit about where you deal quite frankly with issues of racial intolerance and uh, anger and kind of getting back to this idea of identity, about the sort of erasure of Asian Americans from the story of Buddhism in America, and the ways that brings up a lot of complicated feelings for your interviewees and for yourself. And I wonder if you could speak more about that, especially this project being, you said, about 7 years from start to finish. A lot
mhm.
has changed in the American
Yeah.
landscape, especially with the recent Atlanta shootings, bringing a heightened consciousness to folks outside of the AAPI community about Asian hate, and of course hateful acts against Asians relating to you know COVID-19, and the
Mhm.
kind of misplaced blame and things like that. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about both the way these issues get brought up within the book, and then sort of how, in very recent times, perhaps like post publication, or maybe after your final draft was submitted, how your thinking about this has continued to move.
Right. No, that's a really great question, right? When I was writing this book, Black Lives Matter was still fairly new. There's maybe only one mention of it during the interviews. And so, in some ways, the book feels a bit like a time capsule, which I think is very valuable because there's actually, the history of Asian American Buddhism is very deep, but unfortunately, much of that history is lost or requires a lot of excavation, as, people like Duncan Williams and Funi Su have done a brilliant job of doing that. And um, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this last section really came out of, I remember in the actual interviews, I actually wanted people to respond to certain blog posts that Aaron had made, and just wanted to ask them about, how it felt to see Asian American Buddhists represented, or not represented at all. And so I think these issues of representation are still very much relevant, but certainly I think Erin's work and the work of many other people have shifted that. We're much farther along than when Erin started blogging. I mean, we have, 3 new associate editors at Lions who are focused on Asian American and African American Black Buddhist issues, for example. So it's been a very unexpected time for this book to come out, right, during a global pandemic and all of the just everything that's going on that you mentioned. So I'd say that my thinking continues to really be informed just by I'm kind of marveling at how many people are talking about issues of race much more openly. I mean, when Aaron began, he would get so much pushback. People would call him a racist. And of course, that still happens, as our colleague Anne Glag, informs us in terms of alt-right Buddhists and that sort of thing. But I see a much bigger group of people willing to really confront issues of race head on and really trying to understand it from a Buddhist perspective. So it's a really exciting time for this book to be sort of one small piece in that in this like much broader conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I wonder if you could say a bit about so I have assigned some of your chapters for my students, first in a graduate course that was an intro to Buddhism, and now in an undergraduate class this semester. So the students haven't read it yet. But one of the things I am, one of my motivations for including it in a class on Intro to Buddhism is, again, to sort of counter this phenomenon of erasure to the story of American Buddhism. I wonder if you could say what your hope, being that this is a kind of hybrid book that includes both academic methods and also very, kind of personal and broader approaches. I wonder if you could say a bit about how Buddhist studies scholars, how you hope they might use the book or what they might take from it. And then on the other side, for a more popular audience, what you hope, maybe the goal is the same, but if you could say a bit about your hopes for how the book would be used, especially in a Buddhist studies context, in an academic context.
I was thinking back to an earlier question you were mentioning, and I was thinking about how when I asked people, I didn't ask people like, are you Buddhist? I'd ask people, when people ask what religion are you, how do you usually respond? And I was thinking how even the ways I framed these questions were very much about opening conversations rather than like getting through a survey, if that makes sense.
Right.
And so I'd say my broader hope, very broadly, is to like open up these kinds of conversations like you and I are having and between people. And honestly, the book kind of came out of a place of like loneliness for myself, of just like, where are all the other young adult Asian American Buddhists? What can we learn from them? And so there's that aspect of wanting to alleviate loneliness. And particularly, I think in the undergrad setting, it's been so heartening for me and just really satisfying, I must say, to hear that it's being taught in college classrooms and in high school classrooms. I believe one feedback from a student that I got through a professor was something like, it feels like she climbed into my backyard and knows way too much about my family, which might be the best compliment I've ever received. I promise I did not stalk anybody for this project. I followed all IRB protocols, but something about, being able to recognize oneself. And I hope then say like, oh, but my experience is different. And I'm hoping, the book has a flame on the cover, and I'm hoping it not only sparks conversations, but more writing on this topic, which to me has been just such a lacuna and such an obvious one. Like I want young people especially to feel that their voices are valuable too. And, I feel like I have a running list of other articles and books that we wish will be written about the Asian American Buddhist experience, whether it's focusing on Hawaii or other geographic regions, since my book is a bit more California centric, or focusing on the experience of LGBTQIA plus folks, talking about sexuality and queerness, class and gender, talking about the experiences of adoptees, Asian American adoptees, or people who are mixed race. I'm very excited for Gen Z, who are, I think that's such a much more normal part of their experience. So how do our kind of like old, somewhat stilted categories of identity hold up to their lived experience? And more broadly, thinking about these international and transnational dimensions to Buddhist identity. So it just feels like there's so many directions to go in. And I hope that, with scholars, take take those directions or introduce their students to them. And I think on a popular level, yeah, I hope that people also explore these directions and in creative ways, so to understand. I think it felt like a bit of a leap of faith for me to write the book, in the way I ultimately did. I think I was fortunate that it wasn't in a PhD. I wasn't trying to get tenure with this or anything. And so to be able to realize there is a place for these kinds of hybrid books. It can take a while and take a lot of perseverance to get them published, but that there is a real value that they can bring people from really different locations together. And I think those particular conversations we're able to have are very generative and really exciting.
Right. I could see too, you were saying part of this is motivated by your own loneliness. And I could see from a popular level, this being a real comfort to other, I'm not in the AAPI community, but I could see, it being comforting to even if you're, sort of in an isolated part of the country or something where maybe you don't have a large AAPI community, perhaps, this book can provide a bit of community, in the way
Yes.
that, it can. I also, was thinking about, what you said about your hope of it being generative. One of the things you provide in the book is an appendix, several appendices, but the first appendix, which I thought was an interesting thing to include, is the questions for other Asian American Buddhists. Could you say a bit about that and what your intent behind including that was?
Sure. It was one of the last interview questions that I asked people. It was kind of, the whole methods model was very snowbally, including at the end, who else should I speak to? But also, what questions would you like to ask other Asian American Buddhists? And so part of the book is bringing together, very different kinds, so to speak, of Asian American Buddhists and realizing people had all sorts of interesting questions for each other. And so I thought, oh, why not put these all into an appendix? And, maybe in a temple or in a sangha, people can use some of these questions to ask each other or use it in a classroom setting or even frankly ask their friends, right? I remember Aaron at one point talking about, it's kind of this common occurrence that people who grew up Buddhist will find out, oh, this other Asian American friend of mine also grew up Buddhist, but they never talked about it. And they might have known each other for years and not known about that dimension until maybe they visited each other's homes and saw the home altar with the fruit on it or something like that. So yeah, that those appendices, I think, it's also part of the hope that people will ask each other these questions, which are sometimes seen as a little bit taboo or a little bit rude questions about religion, politics, race, that kind of thing. But actually, I think there's a way to have these questions that really, open us up to new possibilities.
Yeah, I think, the questions say a lot about, some of these feelings that get addressed and worked through in some of your, in the interviews themselves. It kind of helps reflect the state of mind. The questions are not attributed to individual interviewees, but you get a sense of the kind of, again, this, this myriad voices of the community and of your interviewees just through the questions themselves. As you said, there's, some are a little bit more, aggressive and some are more kind of
Exactly.
contemplative. And, but yeah, I agree. Those lists of questions are great. I wonder if this is a strange thing to ask toward the end of an interview, but I'm wondering if you could explain the title itself, the reference, Be the Refuge.
Sure. Absolutely. Yeah, so Be the Refuge was the last blog post that Aaron ever wrote. He was about his cancer diagnosis. He actually wanted to start a new blog. So he'd had Dharma Folk, this group blog with friends, and then Angry Asian Buddhist. And over the years, he was, I don't know, I think moving towards also thinking about there's a role for anger, there's a role for kind of protest, but also thinking in some ways more generatively and, what are the kinds of spaces we want to create? And so it's such a beautiful blog post. I reproduced it in the book and it's also freely available online. And it really comes out of him asking us, what are the ways that we can be a refuge for each other. He was reflecting on the ways he could be a refuge, even though he had cancer. He was reflecting on the ways other people were a refuge for him during that very difficult time of going through such intense treatments. And so it actually took me a long time to figure out the title. I had a much worse title for a long time. And then, again, I'm very good at missing the obvious. And then it realized of course it has to be the refuge. And that's just this broader invitation that I think we're all figuring out, co-creating this and I think so much of us, especially during this time, there's so much grief. There's so much in the world that's very, very overwhelming. And what are even just the small ways we can be a refuge for ourselves, for each other, or we can seek refuge. And I also liked that, we have the 3 refuges in Buddhism, so that there was that kind of connection to Buddhism as well.
Yes, great. Thank you for explaining that. I think one of the things that this really, the title, really connected for me was this event that you um, co-produced, I would say, the May We Gather. How would you describe your role in co-organizing?
Sure,
Um,
co-organized. One of many,
and
many people who made this event possible.
Sure. So I wonder if you could say a bit about that event and maybe the way it kind of figures into your future projects, your current projects.
Right. So on May 4th, we had this event called May We Gather, a National Buddhist Memorial for Asian American Ancestors. And I co-organized this with Duncan Williams and Funi Su. And it really came out of, for us at first, just conversations about the kind of pain and frustration we were feeling at the rise in anti-Asian violence. And then after the Atlanta shootings, that was a real galvanizing moment for us, where we kind of felt very urgently the need for a kind of ritual that brought together Asian American Buddhists, but also Buddhists of all different backgrounds, and actually people who aren't even Buddhists. So we wanted to keep the events focused or centered on the Asian American Buddhist experience, but inclusive of all. And if people want to learn more about that, they can go to maywegather.org. And there's also the full video of the ceremony, as well as a shorter 10-minute video. And I think that relates a lot to what we were talking about sort of generativity. And to me, what strikes me is that this event really just came out of conversations and friendship, and a lot is possible when we really talk about, in an open way, kind of not just intellectually, but spiritually, emotionally, what's happening for us, especially in the face of so much suffering. I think that can feel so much bigger than ourselves. And so we're, we continue to talk even after this event, and hoping to do another May We Gather for the following year. And I would say, like, the kind of ethos of doing something, if we're going to, Duncan is kind of the type of person who really encourages us, if we're going to do something, let's make it meaningful. And so I think that spirit informs my current work. And I think doing an event like that, seeing, 7,000 people join this live stream, realizing even when we feel isolated and lonely, actually so many people are, care about these issues and are out there. And I think often, I'm married to an academic, so I know that academia itself can be very lonely too, but that there's also this element where we care for what we study. I mean, we're so fortunate in Buddhist studies to study something that just inherently has meaning for many, many people in the world, and has meaning for our students who are grappling not just with intellectual journeys, but spiritual journeys as well. And so I'd say after the event, it's really encouraged me to, continue to integrate these different strands that sometimes we like to keep separate or siloed, and to really have fun with the kind of creative possibilities that emerge when we really think about Asian American Buddhism, as distinct from Asian Buddhism, or as a really, I don't know, a site of a lot of possibility, that I would say a lot of untapped possibility.
Great. Well, along those lines, are you working on a new book project or any new research that you want to share at this time?
Sure. Yeah. I recently finished a memoir about many things about Buddhist chaplaincy and grief and translation and spiritual friendship. So I'm kind of still in that project, seeking a home for that particular project, and have some kind of newer projects percolating, although it feels a little bit early to talk about them. But I would say that I've been thinking a lot about, just absences, and kind of the kinds of Asian American Buddhists were kind of absent. So I was writing into that absence. This memoir project is kind of a response to the chaplaincy memoirs that are out there. And a lot of it is based in Christianity. And there are some really wonderful Buddhist chaplaincy memoirs, Sharon Su, wrote Occupy This Body, for example, recently, but just wanting to see more. So I'd say the memoir is, if Be the Refuge is kind of an invitation for more people to write into this space of Asian American Buddhism, whatever that means. Like, this memoir was my own response, like taking up that call. And then these future projects I've been thinking about kind of Asian American Buddhist literature and just a lot of different things, but I'm kind of a slow writer. Projects take me a long time. So I'm in the kind of baby stages for that. And I'm currently also the Buddhist chaplaincy program coordinator at the Institute of Buddhist Studies. And it's been really fun to kind of go back into that world, since I was living in Southeast Asia for much of the last presidency. And so I was not as connected to chaplaincy, Buddhist chaplaincy and spiritual care. And it's been really wonderful to reconnect back into that world more. So I suspect that will also have a bearing on whatever projects emerge.
Great. Well, I look forward to seeing all that comes next for you. I really enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much, Tori. It's been really such a delight.